long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by Professor of Law Ken Katkin at Chase Law School. Ken, it's been too long since we've been on the show.
If you don't count 2 days ago, but yeah, otherwise it's great to be back.
But we had all of those other people in that show. We had May, we had Mike, and we can't help that sometimes that Mike is just wrong, and so we had to gang up on him a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know how he could have complained about the polls not being right. It seems to me like the polls were exactly right.
I agree. As a matter of fact, for listeners, I am going to say, Ken and I are going to be starting off the show talking about the races on Tuesday. But be aware, on Wednesday, we had a special, but available to everybody, a special episode breaking down what we thought happened in the election. And that was with Mike, May, Ken, and myself. And so we're not going to try to rehash all of that ground. So if you haven't listened to that show, don't forget a lot of information there. And I think it's really good. And Ken, you bring up a really good point. I did. And so as a matter of fact, Mike and I continued to have a conversation about that Discord. And it has been raging on. He has paused for now. But I would say if you're a listener and you don't know, one of the great things about the Politics Guys is we do have some other opportunities for you to become a supporter. And if you're a supporter, you can get access to things like Discord, and you can continue things like Mike and my's debate as we move it online. But Ken, let me bring it back to what we're talking about. I absolutely agree with you. I don't know how, it's the margin of error. I don't know, but we'll let listeners go back. So, Ken, I want to start with the things that we haven't had a chance to get to. Obviously, more votes have been counted, more data has come out, better exit polling information is available. So we can have some important conversations. As a matter of fact, right before we went live with the show, we recognized that we had each had different answers on what was happening in Pennsylvania. Right now, as we're recording on the show today, the Wall Street Journal and some other outlets are calling Pennsylvania for Republican McCormick. However, the New York Times still has it as too close to call. And so right now there's a little bit of discrepancy. We were kind of taking a look at this. But approximately 95 to 99% of the vote has been counted, and McCormick appears to be up by about 30,000 votes. The outstanding question that's difficult to answer at this hour is it 95 or 99%. The Wall Street Journal is saying he's got a 30,000 vote with 99% of the vote being counted, which would indicate that he has in fact won. But if it's 95%, of course, a 30,000 vote lead would not necessarily be enough to have an election call. But it does certainly, if nothing else, it seems as if the Senate is closing in on a potential 53 Republicans in the Senate. So, Ken, on that front, if the Wall Street Journal ends up being correct and Republicans capture that 53rd seat in Pennsylvania, the other item from Pennsylvania is that on the House side, it appears that all of the contested House seats have now gone Republicans, which is moving their numbers closer and closer, a majority there. So they're up more than 8 seats from the last time we talked about this on Wednesday. So why don't we start there in Pennsylvania? What are your thoughts about Pennsylvania? And even the fact that it's this close is, I think, surprising for Democrats because just like in Ohio, a current 3-term Democrat, Bob Casey, well, he's been there for 3 terms, right? This appears, even if it's just close, it appears that there might not be quite the blue wall that I think Democratic operatives hoped there still was.
Yeah, I've been thinking about Pennsylvania a lot. It's really turned into the graveyard for Democrats' hopes this election. So, but I think some of these seats are actually, I think, still too close to have been called. I know you were talking about the two pickups in Pennsylvania in the House,
Yes.
Pennsylvania District 7 and Pennsylvania District 8, where most people have called those as Republican pickups where Democratic incumbents were defeated. And so that would be two of the three districts in the whole country where that in the House where that's been called that way. The other one is in Michigan, but both of those races are still, quite close. In Pennsylvania 7, as I'm looking at the vote tally right now, it's 200,000 for the Republican challenger Ryan McKenzie versus 195,000 for the Democratic incumbent Susan Wild. So a gap of 5,000. That will probably hold up, but they have not counted a lot of absentee ballots, a lot of provisional ballots, things like that yet. So I don't know for sure that I would say that's definite, and 5,000 vote margin. And similarly in Pennsylvania 8, it's a little bit bigger of a margin, about a 7,500 vote margin, where the challenger Robert Bresnahan seems to have defeated the incumbent Democrat Matt Cartwright. That one probably will hold up, but I still think in Pennsylvania there were a large number of provisional ballots. In particular, there was litigation in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court already about whether those provisional ballots should be counted. The issue mostly turned on the question of what if people already asked for and mailed in an absentee ballot, but there was something defective about the absentee ballot that they mailed in so that it wasn't counted. There was litigation about whether those same people should then be allowed to try again on election day. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that they all could. The U.S. Supreme Court did not take that case, although the Republicans asked them to. So there should be a lot of provisional ballots coming in where they haven't been able to even start counting them yet, because they have to wait and make sure that these absentee ballots, they didn't try again by a second absentee ballot before they could start counting their provisional ballots. So I think Pennsylvania is going to be slow to finish counting in some of the closest races. That, of course, does include the U.S. Senate race. And I think it's not surprising that even while the Republican Senate candidate McCormick has claimed victory already, that he's still filing a lot of lawsuits yesterday and today to try to stop votes from being counted that are right now on track to be counted.
So the other bit here, and I get, right, we have this conversation about the term of, well, should we be calling it? Should we not be calling it? But either way, even if maybe kind of a skin of the teeth victory comes out for a Democrat on one of these three, what does that suggest about Democratic incumbents at the non-presidential level, that they're coming out this? And so this is something worth thinking about a little bit more deeply for listeners as well. Incumbency advantage is huge. Generally incumbents win, and the longer that you are in office, the bigger that incumbent advantage becomes. And so to even be this close with challengers, that's a major shift. And so when you talk there about how you've been thinking about Pennsylvania, how does that kind of, at best, skin of the teeth win, if it happens that way, set things up, you think, in Pennsylvania in terms of Democratic strategy moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, Pennsylvania is a real bellwether here, so it requires some thinking about, what the problem was. And I don't really know which hypothesis is correct, but I can think of different hypotheses that would lead to different conclusions, right? So one hypothesis would be, if you look at Pennsylvania in the context of the whole country, and in fact the whole all Western democracies, this year was a pretty tough year for incumbents everywhere, right? No matter which parties they were. The pandemic happened. Life after the pandemic in most places was not, people didn't love it. It was a difficult time with a lot of discontent. And all over the globe, incumbents are being voted out. And that happened here in Pennsylvania and in the United States writ large, I guess. So one way to look at that is it's just transitory, and that it doesn't signify huge problems. It just signifies what turned out turned out to be an unusual year where incumbency had disadvantages as well as the usual advantages. So that's one way to think about it. I'm not saying that's right or that that's the only way to think about it, but yeah, a different way to think about it is that the country and in fact the whole world or most of the world are in fact shifting to the right. That there's been a general drift towards the right, and so the headwinds were very strong, and that would either mean that the Democrats are going to have a little period in the wilderness, but until that shifts back, or it would mean that they're going to have to start also moving to the right. And these are types of debates that both the Democrats and the Republicans have faced. After almost every election, the losing party would say, "Well, do we need to move more towards the center, or do we just need to stand our ground and wait till the winds blow the other way?" And I'm not sure what the right answer to that is either. And I'm not really even sure, whether the right answer is that the winds are blowing to the right or that the winds are just blowing against incumbents. Because if winds are just blowing against incumbents, they're going to blow against Trump now that he's the incumbent. So I don't know. What do you think, Trey?
I would be very hesitant to suggest that incumbency advantage it flipped and ergo it was a disadvantage. I think the more likely explanation, and as a matter of fact, again, on Discord and elsewhere, I called Pennsylvania for Trump. And part of the reason for that was earlier this year, I don't know if you remember, Ken, but I got to interview Lainey Newman, and she and Theda Skocpol. Skocpol's a really, really famous political scientist, a comparativist political scientist. And Lainey Newman was one of her graduate students. They wrote this book together, Rust Belt Union Blues. And they use a lot of qualitative evidence to suggest that the Democratic Party needs to be deeply worried because while unions as an institution have not turned red, that union members and individuals in poor areas are increasingly turning more conservative, and they have not found the kinds of the policies the Democrats have suggested would be helpful have not in fact felt or been helpful to them. And that was the thesis of their book. And I was deeply convinced by interviewing Lainey, and that sent me on some paths. And so when I saw that being close, my suggestion was I think it's going to turn for Trump because I don't think Democrats have accurately recognized that they are not the party of the working voter in the sense of middle-ish, lower middle class and lower voters anymore. I think we see that in the exit polls as well, Ken. This past cycle here, on Tuesday, Trump moved by winning non-college degree voters 4 points with Biden to 12 points under Trump. Meanwhile, Harris, she 18% the college education vote, but that's really effectively not that much wider than what Biden had. And I know that on the Wednesday show as well, you had talked about, is this feeling versus not a feeling. And I've looked at these numbers more closely again. Inflation, if you look in terms of the post-Biden presidency, has not exactly caught up. The gains in income have not quite caught up with those inflationary gains. But if you look at it even more closely, unevenly distributed. And so I really think that what has most thrown Democrats for a loop was an underlying assumption that they controlled these portions of the electorate. And you add on the fact that you then have Latinos and men breaking for Republicans in much bigger ways than the past, and there just wasn't a lot of room to win. And so I think the soul searching, I don't agree with him often, but I do think that Bernie Sanders is right in the sense that the Democratic Party has lost that battle, and that is a fundamental reason why we see, I think Pennsylvania, you're right, is a bellwether, but I think that's why.
Yeah, I think there's parts of what you said that I would agree with and parts I would disagree with. So of course it would be impossible to disagree, and I have to agree with your kind of looking at the numbers and saying that Trump made big inroads to not non-college educated male working class voters. But I think the question of why that is, I think there's a lot of room to think about that, and Biden's policies have been quite good for people in those demographics. If they're in labor unions, Biden's been the most pro-labor union president since Harry Truman, and he, so many of the provisions in the infrastructure bill or in the Inflation Reduction Act that allocate a lot of federal money for a lot of big projects require labor unions to unionized workforces to be hired to do that work, and so I think he delivered quite a lot to them. And also, when you point out that the wage increases were unevenly distributed, that's true. But the low end was one of the beneficiaries of that uneven distribution. So the de facto minimum wage in the whole country has gone up to about $15 an hour, just at that being the market rate, which is much higher than the statutory rate, and increases from $10 an hour to $15 an hour, more than overtook the inflation rates that people had to pay if they're at that end of the income spectrum. So I think what we're really talking about is a messaging problem and not a problem about policies. So I would not think that, if the problem is that certain categories of workers feel like things are getting expensive for them. I don't think there'd be any need to change policies. I think there'd be much more need to change messaging so that people understand that. There was a huge article in the New Yorker about all the construction that's happening in red states because of the Biden infrastructure bill and because of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed on a completely partisan vote, where there's many places where the local populations in these red states are, very excited about the projects that are happening and the jobs that are being created, and they just don't, they don't know that these were Democratic initiatives, and so I think that would signal much more of a need for more messaging on those issues rather than for any really kind of deep substantive changes.
Talk about that a little bit, because I think we do have a data disagreement here. Because when you take a look at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, when you take a look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so for example, if you're looking at the area from the beginning of Biden until June 2022, individuals in the lowest income brackets were between experiencing inflation at a 19 to 18.6% go, which did in fact outstrip the same amount of wage change over that time. Again, at least according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Yeah, but no. But can I say that you're looking at a very short period of time, and the wage growth happened over a longer period of time?
Absolutely. But if I'm looking at this, you'd have to go back and start prior to Biden to get all the gains that you would need.
Yeah, but
overcome inflation.
Right, but I'm saying low-end wages in the past 4 years have gone up about 50%, and you're talking about inflation numbers that in 1 year were about 19%, but in the subsequent years were maybe 2%.
Let's see. So you're suggesting that the average wage increased by approximately 50% during Biden's
at the low end, yeah, for people who were making
exactly what we're talking about. Yes, yeah. Well.
Yeah, not my wages or your wages, but people who are earning less than $15 an hour.
I think they have that here as well. I don't think I'd put that up there. 20. Oh, that's I don't want to. That's not what I want. Well, I'll look at that some more, Ken.
Yeah.
But I hear you, but maybe I'm wrong. Again, I'm not the Democrat. I'm not the Democrat here, right?
Yeah. And I think another thing about that is also that when a lot of the cause of the inflation when it actually happened was that the government just kept spending money to prop up the economy during the pandemic when there was there was everything was shut down, right? So a lot of businesses were sustained through that period rather than going out of business because of government programs programs that like the PPP loans and things, so that those businesses are still around, people are still working there. And so there's this temporary period of time when there's a lot of money sloshing around and not a lot of goods and services sloshing around. So people feel that in that year as inflationary, but there's huge benefits from it going forward because the inflation has been brought under control, and basically the whole system of small business that we have in this country didn't completely seize up and fail because which it would have without the Biden policies.
Be careful about that, right? So I mean, I hear you saying that, but so for example, mortgage rates have not declined in the linear fashion in which the Federal Reserve expected them to in response to their changing of the monetary policy. So I don't disagree with you. I mean, but we have had this disagreement over time. You thought that inflation was going to come down a lot faster than it did. I disagreed with that.
It did come down.
Maybe I was a little more I think I was a little too pessimistic, and I think you were a little too optimistic. When it was all
the inflation came down quickly. It only really lasted about a year and a half. It's just that it was very severe during that year and a half. But we're already longer than that since there's even been any inflation.
Well, we are still experiencing higher than normal inflation, especially for a period in which the Fed is increasing rates, which is why that I'm pointing to houses, which explains why on some of loans we're seeing continued high rates, despite the fact that there should be triggers to send them down. So again, I'm not here trying to have some kind of panic and say, oh my goodness, inflation is just around massive inflation is just around the corner in the way that we experienced it. But I guess I am trying to caution you to say, I think that it's not just a messaging issue that the Democrats are experiencing here when you are continuing to have mortgage rates tick up over the past month, even in the face of the Fed lowering rates, which suggests that there are still inflationary pressures, even if they're lower than they have been.
Well, I'm just looking at a news headline from September 11th of 2024, which is not even 2 months ago, and it says inflation falls to its lowest level in more than 3 years. So I think I don't think there's much inflation now. I think the current rate is about 2.4%. The Fed actually targets 2%, so that's 2.4% is almost exactly at where inflation is supposed to be, and it's been that way for more than a year now. So I mean, it kept coming down, but it's been within normal ranges for more than a year now. Now, it is true that right after the pandemic, it shot up. And I think when you talked about 11, I think it was 7 in 1 year and then 6 the next year. So it ended up being about 13 total across 2 years, which is a lot. But there were it wasn't because of government policies that the rates shot up so much. It was because the pandemic greatly reduced the availability of goods and services, and the government policy that was involved, it was an emergency policy in response to the pandemic to try to keep some of this business afloat.
And again, I don't disagree with that, but okay, let's come back to October. So October, if you exclude energy prices, it wasn't at 2, it was 3.3% year over year. So I know that seems small when we're talking about these numbers, but I again, maybe I'm wrong. It seems unlikely that it's just a messaging problem then for Democrats. If individuals felt more secure, that is in fact one of the biggest indicators of voting behavior. And so, given the amount of time you had with both Biden and Harris, if all you had was a disconnect gap between actual purchasing power and messaging, it doesn't seem likely to me that you would have had such a huge switch in places like Pennsylvania. And I will add to that argument something we talked a little bit, but kind of skirted it. That's because I don't think, let me be careful here. There is not significant evidence in political science to suggest that campaigns are the fundamental determiner of how people vote. And so I'm always hesitant when somebody says, hey, look, it was the messaging that was primarily problematic. I generally want to step back and say, but was it because much of a variable is messaging? And when we try to isolate campaigns and their effects on the outcomes of elections, it's not that they have none, but they are certainly lower than other kinds of variables like this.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I think that when I'm talking about messaging now, I'm trying not to only limit it to campaigns. So I think
Okay.
one of the headwinds that Harris was up against is that the internet in particular, is it's there all the time. It's not just there during campaigns, but it's really a right wing disinformation bubble for many people. So even beginning with just like kids who play video games, that kind of thing will end up getting them sent to far right websites and things like that. And there's no left wing equivalent of that out there, right? So there's just this kind of I feel like there's a lot of propaganda that's reaching a lot of people when it's campaign season, when it's not campaign season. And some of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about messaging is that maybe the American left or center left is going to have to try to be as much of a presence. I hate to use the word propagandizing, but at least doing counter propaganda to what the right's already doing all the time to kind of shape different ideologies and different understandings of where we are. And if you talk about older demographics who aren't on the internet as much, a lot of the older Americans are really just watching Fox News all the time. And there is an MSNBC, but it hasn't been able to get that kind of grip on, just really shaping ideologies of people. And so I think some of that has to happen outside of campaigns. The one other thing I was going to say about campaigns, and again, I don't at all disagree with your claim that the campaign messaging itself has a small impact. I agree with that. But I think in this race, one thing that I think is interesting is, every single state shifted to the right. There's no state that didn't. But we had these 7 battleground states where the campaigns were active, and then we had 43 states where there was very little campaign activity. Ads weren't running there, things like that. And if you look at how big were the shifts in these states, I saw some stats today that were showing that the shift between the 2020 election and the 2024 election, the presidential elections, that is, in the 43 states that weren't battleground states, it moved 7 points towards Trump. But if you look at the 7 states that were battleground states where the campaigns actually had campaign operations in place, those only moved 3 points towards Trump. So I think the significance of that would be to say that the campaigning did something. It didn't do enough. It didn't do enough, but it had to have done something, because Harris got beat everywhere compared to Biden 4 years ago, but she got beat by twice as much in the places that she wasn't campaigning as the places that she was campaigning. And that includes both the red states and the blue states where she wasn't campaigning. That in no matter whether it was red or blue, there was a 7-point shift against her in the non-battleground states, whereas there's only a three-point shift against her in the battleground states.
I think this brings us kind of intuitively to the next thing that we didn't really have a chance on Wednesday to get into, and that is, we're already talking about the economy, but what about things where we can get at issues? And one of those that obviously was on the ballot was abortion rights, and so we had that on a number of states: Montana, South Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado, Missouri, Arizona, Nevada, New York, Michigan, Maryland, and Florida. And what we saw there is that with only 3 exceptions, those abortion rights, because these are in states where we're not talking about battleground states. Florida is not in play. Nebraska, South Dakota. Right. These were not, besides say like Arizona, we're primarily talking about locations not there. But in those states too, one of the hand from the Democratic side was an assumption that those voting for the abortion rights ballots would be inclined to vote for Democrats, and specifically for Harris. But although they pass more than they fail, the only failures are going to be partially in Nebraska, South Dakota, and in Florida. But be careful about some of those numbers, because unlike with the candidates we're talking about, for Florida, for example, you've got to beat a 60% threshold to pass those kinds of ballot initiatives, so they're higher. So it actually did better. You had more than a majority in Florida, but those states that were not battleground, Harris did not as well. And so that suggests to me, Ken, I'm curious how this interacts with the thesis you were laying out. That suggests to me that Democrats were wrong in assuming that abortion was an issue that they could capture votes for, and instead has really become an intra-Republican debate and question. And that might explain why Harris is underperformed those voters. And in that case, how does that mesh with or not mesh with your thesis there?
I think it supports my thesis that the problem was a messaging problem, right? Because if you look at what you just talked about, which is actually I think South Dakota was the only one of the 10 where a majority of voters rejected abortion rights, and then you had 7 of 10 where the as you said the amendments passed, and the other 2, which is Nebraska and Florida, where in Florida 57% of the voters did vote for the abortion rights. It just wasn't enough to pass, and in Nebraska I believe they passed 2. Didn't they pass one that was pro-abortion rights and one that was anti-abortion rights?
So it was kind of weird. The protection for abortion in Nebraska failed, but the restriction on it succeeded. There was 2 different pieces to it. It was a weird little double ballot initiative. As a matter of fact, the way they put it when you look at it there specifically. So the one that failed would have enshrined the right to abortion until fetal viability, and then the one that, so it's still going to be prohibited.
No, but didn't the one pregnancy. The one that passed did protect it until 12 weeks of pregnancy. So that's more than that's not. It didn't allow a total abortion ban.
No, it is still. I think it is. Let's see. No,
So in other words, the one that failed would have restored Roe, but the one that passed.
So what happened was the one that would have restored Roe
failed.
The one that succeeded was a ban on abortion in the 2nd and 3rd trimesters.
Right, but that didn't ban it in the 1st trimester.
Yeah, but it's already, weirdly, it doesn't do a lot because it's already banned through 12 weeks in Nebraska. That's why Nebraska was a particularly difficult one to understand for any of the listeners looking at it.
Oh, so I'm sure I don't know that I understood it yet. Then you're saying they didn't protect it in the first 12 weeks. There is a total ban in Nebraska now.
It is currently prohibited. You only have 12 weeks in Nebraska, and that is by law. So what that ballot, what the measure did was it just enshrined in their constitution what is already by law there. It didn't change anything. Does that make sense?
That sounds more like what I thought it did, but I would think that by enshrining it in the Constitution, they're protecting the right to abortion during the first 12 weeks. They're just banning it after the first 12 weeks.
It's only banning it in the 2nd and 3rd trimesters. Absolutely.
Yeah, so that actually is in a sense a protection. It's a smaller protection, right? But it's saying that the
larger protection failed, the smaller protection succeeded. There's another way to think about that.
Right. Yeah, another way to think about it. That it is making it unconstitutional to have a first trimester ban, even at the same time that they are imposing a 2nd and 3rd trimester ban.
Yes.
Yeah,
and what also I think makes that a little confusing is Nebraska already had that by law, approximately. Mm-hmm. Since by law, it was at that 12 weeks of pregnancy to start with. So it's a shift, but the shift is from law to the Constitution, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's perfect. So getting back to what I think that means, I mean, again, I think it clearly shows that in 8 out of 10 states, maybe not in Nebraska or South Dakota, the voters were aligned with Democratic positions on the issue of abortion more than with Republican positions on the issue of abortion. And so again, I would say, well, if the voters are aligned with the Democrats' positions, but yet they're voting for Republicans, it seems to me that the problem is not the positions, it's the messaging. So I would just say that's kind of more evidence that the Democrats need to think more systemically about getting people to understand what the Democrats actually stand for. And I think on the abortion issue, Trump also did his usual good job of confusing the hell out of people about what he stands for, because he did speak out of both sides of his mouth on this issue continuously through the whole campaign.
Changed. Yeah. I mean, he said that, okay, listen, no, I'm not actually for an abortion ban at a national level.
Well, yeah, and I think but at one time he would sometimes say that he was, and then other times he would say that he wouldn't sign it.
Earlier in the campaign cycle, he definitely did. And then there was this moment when he switched. As a matter of fact, I remember it vividly because May and I talked about it and its potential ramifications on him. I think in this case he was his whether he knew it, it was intuitive, or he had some better polling data. I think he clearly hit the right item there.
Yeah, so he is the president who intentionally appointed the justices that got Roe versus Wade overturned, but yet he, was able to confuse enough voters that they didn't really think there was a big difference between the two candidates on the issue of abortion, and that allowed some pro-choice voters who clearly proved they were pro-choice by voting for pro-choice ballot initiatives to also vote for Trump. And so I think his method of messaging often was just to talk out of both sides of his mouth and leave people really confused about what he meant. And I don't think that's something that I would want the Democrats to emulate, but I think the Democrats need to come up with different ways of really helping voters understand, not just at election time, but all the time, what kinds of things they are for and Republicans are against.
I would be careful there because I read that slightly differently. I don't think it was deeply confusing who was more pro-choice in this particular instance. Let's put it that way. I think the problem is that pocketbook outweighed those other issues, and when voters had a chance to effectively split ticket, they did.
Yeah, it could be. Although, I was looking, so of course the
I should be careful here, Ken. I'm sorry, because I said just pocketbook, but as I mentioned on Wednesday, it's pocketbook, and the other one, and we haven't even talked about this yet because we spent so much time on Wednesday. I think the other one that was underestimated when we look at these exit polls was the amount of immigration stop that people want. I mean, overwhelmingly. And again, I recognize I do not fall into the typical narrative here, so I'm just calling it as the data suggests it. But we do not want legal or illegal immigration in the United States,
right.
And that also I think comes out. So I want to be careful there. I didn't want to just assume it was just pocketbook. Sorry.
Right. I think it was immigration even more. But what I was going to say about abortion, just before we leave it, is, of course there was a big gender gap, and women are probably more likely to vote on reproductive choice issues, and women did vote mostly for Harris. But if you drill down into that data, of course, it depended a lot within women voters about the level of education that they have, and among white women in particular, white women with college degrees voted pretty overwhelmingly for Harris, but white women in total, including all white women with and without college degrees, actually voted, I think, 54% for Trump. So, to me, one of the things I would take from that is that the voters who were more educated and had a better understanding of where the candidates actually stood on the reproductive choice issues, did think it was a voting issue and did vote for Harris over it. But I think that the level of kind of confusion that Trump was able to sow seemed to me like it was more effective with the lower education voters, including the lower education white women voters who really helped put him over the top. I think his confusing messaging kind of diffused that issue for some voters as being, so they just didn't understand, how different the two candidates were. And so I would think that on the immigration thing that you started to talk about, though, I'd say, I think that was the even bigger one. I feel like although people talk about economics, I don't credit it as much. I think people talk about that because that's a polite and socially acceptable reason that they can give for why they voted for Trump. But I think for a lot of them, they were voting for Trump out of just kind of somewhere in the range between fear and hate of immigrants, and particularly non-white immigrants, and that really did appeal to a lot of voters.
Well, and let's talk about that for just a minute, because this also clearly took Democrats by surprise. And one of the things, I've been reading about this, looking at it post, it was, I don't want to say shocking, but it was unique. Take a look at what a lot of Democratic strategists were suggesting. And it seemed to be the takeaway, at least as of Thursday, was, this has been an issue for us, but it's an issue we're not aligned with the country. We need to become a more closed border. What's your take on that front, Ken?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, I have to acquiesce to it. I would not like us to be a more closed border country, and I don't think you would either. But
No,
but yeah, yeah.
I'm probably a little bit, as we've talked about.
Yeah,
I might outflank you on that one.
On that, yeah. But no, but I do think the Dems can't help but move in that direction. In fact, they already had, because you'll remember, of course, Biden had been negotiating primarily, I think, with your senator from Oklahoma,
Langford.
Langford, yeah, for a bipartisan deal that would have tightened up the border very considerably, and much more than any previous Democratic president ever would have wanted to go along with. But Biden and Harris were negotiating that with Republicans because that's where the voters had moved, and Trump knew that too. And then Trump told the Republican senators not to vote for it, not because he didn't agree with the substance of that legislation, but because he didn't want the Democrats to get credit for solving immigration problems, even when the Democrats were perfectly willing to accept Republican solutions to the immigration problems. So I think it all of that says to me that the public is not where I am, and it's not where you are, and it cares a lot about this issue, and that in the short run, it's an issue that Democrats have to be more willing to kind of bite their tongues on and just do what the voters want. But hopefully, in the medium and long runs, through persuasion, they can kind of persuade voters that we could go back to a little looser immigration policies. But I think they have to move popular opinion first, and I think right now, while popular opinion is where it is, they have to get in line with it.
Yeah, and when you drill into exit polling, it was weird to see that even in urban, traditionally Democratic areas, that when people voted against Harris, that was often the number one issue in kind of our own backyard. And I again, I don't know about the idea of trying to lead populations and agenda set in that way. I have questions about how that can actually be done, but I'm going to put those aside for a second. And I will at least agree with you on the front that, again, this is not me speak, as you said, that's not where I want to be. But I don't think Democrats even now win on what Biden and Langford had worked through. I don't think that's strict based on the kinds of exit polling we're seeing. I think that will be viewed as far too of a left policy. And it will be, I will be curious to observe what that looks like in practice as we move forward. But yeah, I think as long as that's going to be a huge one for the Democrats to have to kind of wade through, because at the same time, Ken, you got to be careful. Although, Trump wins a lot of Latino voters, there's a balancing act, I think, there for Democrats. Well, I want to move forward just a little bit here, though, Ken, to one last domestic item, and then we're going to move overseas for just a minute. Talked on Wednesday, especially asking May questions in terms of what she thought would be those, what will it look like for Trump to be governing? And Wednesday evening, we got our first kind of look at that as we learned that Elon Musk joined a call with Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky, including a conversation about Starlink and the future of that conversation. Although in that particular phone call, based on anonymous sources, it was primarily discussing Starlink. But we also know that there are more phone calls set up and that Musk is going to be a part of that process. So it seems that to this point, at least, Trump, there's always kind of that question of what does Trump actually do with the things that he says, or if we want to kind of take the J version, how do we look into Trump's heart and decide, what did he really mean when he said what he said? But it seems on this front that he did mean to include individuals like Musk, and maybe that will include as well RFK Jr. What are your parting final thoughts on that before we move to Germany?
Yeah, I don't know what Trump. I don't think Trump has a lot of deeply held beliefs. I think largely he's very transactional and is willing to change positions quickly if he thinks there's something in it for him. I think on the immigration stuff that we talked about, I think that's an exception. I think he's very committed to that, to doing what he can to have some kind of mass deportations. I don't see him changing on that. I see some possibilities for him being blocked on that, but not for him changing his view on that. that. Other things, he basically, as we talked about earlier on today's show, paradoxically, he got himself elected, at least in part on inflation, but all of his policies are, if he implements the ones he's been talking about, are inflationary, right? If he does do these mass deportations, then there's going to be great upward pressure on domestic wages, particularly in low wage sectors of the economy. If he puts on all these tariffs, there's going to be big sales taxes, which are going to be inflationary. So, I think if he does try out some of those agendas, because he just doesn't understand the basic economics of the situation, and then he sees that there's going to be inflation, there's going to be pushback. I think he'd probably back off on that pretty quickly at that point. So I think if he implements tariffs in a bigger way at all, I think they won't last that long. And also, as we've seen some other things he talks about, he had been talking about banning TikTok, until the CEO of TikTok, gave him a few $1 million, and now he's talking about no more need to ban TikTok. And I think that is largely the way he wants to operate, is kind of a cash and carry type administration, which means it's a little more unpredictable what kinds of programs he's really going to stick with. So I think we just have to wait and see.
We don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to get to Germany, Ken, and just chat briefly about their own ongoing slow-folding election coalition issue. And so to get everybody up to speed just quickly, Germany until this week was led what was sometimes called the traffic light coalition, because it involved 3 different parties coming together to form a majority in their lower chamber: the Social Democratic Party, the Greens, and the Free Democratic Party. And these 3 groups, they was a tenuous relationship. The SPD is really a social policy, labor rights, economic stability party. It is where the chancellor has come from, the SPD, Olaf Scholz. But to put that together, he had to work with the Greens and the FDP. The FDP are going to be more kind of libertarian-leaning, lower taxes, deregulation, and then the Greens, as their name kind of suggests, is primarily on renewable energy and reducing carbon emissions. Those kinds of issues, once upon a time, had been more about stopping nuclear power in Germany, but that has kind of evolved in more recent times. And they had come together, but they had some big disagreements on climate, on economic policy. But this past week, what ends up happening is that Chancellor Scholz fires his finance minister, who belongs to the FDP, and as a result, the FDP has pulled out of that governing coalition, and that leaves the SPD and the Greens without a majority. Now, that doesn't end government. Germany's a little bit in that sense. So those 2 parties are still governing, but they're governing as a minority, a majority party, if you will. And there's a history to this. In Germany, even though they do have a parliamentary system, a parliamentary legislature, you can't just bring down a chancellor with a simple vote of no confidence. You need what's called in Germany a constructive vote of no confidence. You have to replace that individual with somebody. And if you don't do that, then you have to call for new elections. As a matter of fact, just a little bit of interesting history. There have only been 2 constructive votes of no confidence in the history of Germany. One in 1949 that was unsuccessful, and then one in 1982 that was successful. Now, Chancellor Scholz has said he will call for new elections in January, but the FDP and other smaller parties say that is effectively going to take because of the voting complications in Germany. Just a quick, we've talked about this a long time ago, but Germany actually has a mixed electoral system with both proportional representation and single-member districts. And right now, polling and others appears that what is called the Alternative for Germany, or the AfD, which is a much further right party, looks to be winning a lot of ground and might be a big part of a future governing coalition if it was held if the election is held sooner than January, although it's kind of hard to see around that. So Ken, thoughts about, Germany is normally like the bastion of stability. So this is really unusual. Again, these kinds of rules about constructive votes of no confidence, it is designed to be stable because they're trying to avoid kind of those Weimar instability issues that they had historically prior to World War II. So thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, we talked earlier in the show. I was trying to put our election here in a global context of just in the post-pandemic period, just this sort of global dissatisfaction in democratic countries, global unrest, global anti-incumbent sentiment, and in Germany. It's been on steroids because first they had to have, I think this is their first ever time where they needed three parties to form a coalition. Yes. Yeah, just to make a government. So usually they can do that with two parties. It's often the case that you don't have one party with a majority of the parliament, but two parties would be typical.
It so stable because you have that.
Yeah.
They've even had sometimes what you call the grand coalition, where the major right and left have come together to form. It hasn't happened often, but it has happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Because those are center left and center right parties, and they'd rather sometimes work with each other than let the far left or far right parties get into a government. But this time, you had, I guess, three of the more centrist parties. The Greens, I guess, would be a little further left, but only they're really only interested in some issues. And then you had kind of the main center left and main center right party in this coalition, and it didn't hold. And I'm not even sure one election is going to be enough now. We watched that whole fiasco in Israel a couple of years ago when Netanyahu finally got back in, where they had to have about a half a dozen elections because after each election, they couldn't, the parties that got the seats couldn't produce a coalition that had a majority. And that could be what we're looking at.
It can't happen quite like Israel, their parliamentary rules. So they wouldn't have to have. So in the same way, right now, government's not brought down is a little bit different than, say, in Israel. So in most countries, you're absolutely right. If you can't get a majority, you can't move forward. That's not exactly. You start getting into some pretty detailed comparative analysis. So you're right. It could take some time, but it wouldn't. Just to be clear for listeners, it wouldn't be the same thing where you have an election. Germany doesn't work that way.
Right. So you're saying Scholz would actually be able to hang on as a caretaker chancellor if no government can be formed. Mm-hmm. But he'd be subject to a pretty it would be a true caretaker government. They would not be able to do very much
because you don't have a majority. You can't pass anything.
You can't pass anything. Exactly. Yeah.
It's very different. In the United States, we're so used to this idea of people are going to cross lines potentially. Who's going to vote what way? That is not how this works when you're forming parliamentary systems.
Yeah, and here we have mostly a two-party system. We do occasionally have some independents getting in, but just in very tiny numbers, and rarely do the independents have the ability to control outcomes in the United States. But in Germany, the small parties might be needed to form majorities, and of course they've got the problem now that the AfD party, which is basically the neo-Nazi party, is getting popular in some parts of Germany, mostly in the former East Germany, and nobody wants them to be part of any coalition government, and they're not going to get a majority. But the more they get seats, and then nobody wants to let them in their coalition, the more that means that there's fewer and fewer seats left from parties that could be in the coalition. So it makes it harder to form a government for that reason as well. So I think it's a tough time in the world for democracy right now. Democracy's under a lot of internal and external pressures, and in Germany, I think this is mainly internal. But it's just that they're at a level of polarization right now, as we are here, where it's just harder for them to keep going with the form of government that has really been sort of the model of democratic stability for most other democracies in the past few decades. And you said it perfectly. Most people would look at German democracy and say that they've really, that's a system that works. And now we're even seeing a little bit of a pressure on that.
Well, Ken, I think on that note, we're going to need to end the show. Now, be aware, if you're not already a supporter of the Politics Guys, you should consider becoming one. Scroll down and think about joining the Politics Guys, because here in just a few minutes, Ken and I are going to be recording and releasing our Politics Guys exclusive show. And for Ken and myself, we have been working our way through the United States Constitution, and most recently through the amendments to the Constitution. And we're going to be approaching once again the 14th Amendment, and we'd love for you to be a part of that. And one of the really cool things about tackling something like the Constitution, that means is you weren't here when we were first doing it, but the Constitution doesn't change that rapidly. And so there's a lot of content there. If you become a supporter, it just immediately gets unlocked. And not just what Ken and I have done, but what the other hosts have done as well. But I'm going to point to ours first because it's the best. And so you need to become a supporter of the Politics Guys to get those kinds of good things. I mentioned at the beginning of the show some of the other advantages of being a supporter of the Politics Guys. We had our Wednesday deep, and Mike and I continued that conversation along with supporters on our very active Discord group. So please head and take a look at all the different levels of support of the Politics Guys. And if you want to do that, you can go to patreon.com/politicsguys. Again, that's patreon.com/politicsguys. And you can see those levels of support, and you can support us there and get access to all of those goodies like our supporters exclusive shows and our Discord group. Support the show in other ways as well. We're on Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. All of those support links are in the show notes, as well as being at politicsguys.com/support. Now, if you're not in a position to get the supporters exclusive show financially, you're in luck. There's ways to make that happen. And so if you would just reach out at mail@politicsguys.com, we can talk with you and get something set up. Now, whether you're a supporter or not, you rating and subscribing to this podcast is huge, and I suggest that you do that as soon as you get done listening. If you've got a question, comment, correction, gripe, or anything else you'd like to share, you can always reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and X, and you can find all of those links, you guessed it, in the show notes. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode next week, and I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,